Hello, everyone. We're about to get started with a session on the Conservation International's Natural Climate Solutions Exponential Roadmap. So please settle in if you're here for the session. If not, we'd ask you to either make space or pay attention rather than use this as an office. So if you're just doing work, please make room for folks who are here for the session. Thank you. We're about to get started, folks. Thank you so much.
So, hello, dear colleagues. Please take your seats. Wonderful to see you all here. Friendly and collegial faces. Wonderful to be here with all of you. Welcome, colleagues, to take their seats, and so we can begin. So, first of all, welcome to the Nature Zone. Welcome to this session on Exponential Roadmap for Natural Climate Solutions. I am Irene Suarez, and I am the nature lead for the Climate Champions, Mahmoud Mohildin and Nigel Topping, who serve the UNFCCC. So I am joined today by a panel to discuss a new set of tools to rapidly accelerate unlocking of natural climate solutions. And I'm being attacked by a fly. So joined with a fantastic panel to discuss a new set of tools to rapidly accelerate funding for and accelerate the deployment of cost-effective natural climate solutions. And we will have two sessions in this same session. The first section will be focused on the science behind the natural climate solutions, and the second section will be focused on delivery. on the delivery of natural climate solutions. And we will be hearing from an investor and also from a government representative on the deployment of natural climate solutions. So before we begin, I just want to frame this and remind everyone that natural climate solutions are actions that increase carbon storage and remove greenhouse gases from grasslands, agricultural lands, forest lands, and also wetlands. And these obviously not only enhance livelihoods of people, but also they enhance adaptation and help us obviously advance multiple sustainable development goals. So very important to keep this in mind in the framing of the entire session. So despite there has been enormous growing recognition of the role of nature in the achievement of the Paris Agreement, and specifically on the urgency of deployment of natural climate solutions, it has been very slow uptake on the implementation. And one of the reasons we believe this is the case is that we haven't had a comprehensive roadmap and tools that are shared by multiple stakeholders on how to deliver this. So that's why Conservation International, Potsdam Institute, Exponential Roadmap, and WWF gathered to create this roadmap and was launched in Climate Week New York City. And it was received and celebrated by many. And we're thrilled to have it now in COP27, and it's being shared by many other policy and science platforms, included collaboration with System Change Lab and the State of Climate Action Report, also the 2030 breakthroughs, which I'll explain in a moment. And lastly, it's also being integrated into the COP27 presidency's Nature-Based Solutions partnership that will be launched on the 16th of November here in COP27. So, as I was mentioning, we will kick off with a scientific panel now, and it is my honor to introduce Johan Rockström, the director of Potsdam Institute and chief scientist of Conservation International. He is also the author of Exponential Roadmap for Natural Climate Solutions, and I will also introduce Michael Wollesen, who is the lead author of the roadmap and managing director of Natural Climate Solutions Roadmap Initiative at Conservation International. So after Johan sets the scene, please do pass the microphone to Michael Wollesen to go over the backbone of the roadmap. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And we'll be basically sharing the same presentation, Mike and I. So, and Mike will be running the slides. But let me just set the frame for this to begin with. I mean, in my work on climate science, supporting climate policy, this is probably one of the most important advances we've made over the past at least decade in terms of getting finally a scientifically based integrated framework to guide the transformation towards a safe and just landing for humanity within the Paris Agreement. And the reason for this, as you know, is that we focused all our attention on the carbon law for fossil fuel phase out, but we have neglected the carbon law for nature, that we need to have a quantitative scientific pathway that we have to have as an additionality together with the phase out of fossil fuels. And finally, we actually have that framework. And that's what we presented, and we like to build partnerships around the implementation for that. Now, the IPCC, in the sixth assessment, concludes that nothing less than an integrated framework for climate and nature is required. If you take the next two, so the high-level conclusion, as we all know, is that it's now unequivocally clear that we're causing global warming, but also that we're threatening the stability of the entire planet. So that is the point that we've come to, and that is the Earth system in its entirety that regulates whether or not we'll be able to have a safe landing. And it's followed by this fundamental recognition that it's actually the living biosphere, meaning freshwater, biodiversity, land, all the forest systems, wetlands, peatlands, all the irrecoverable carbon systems in the living nature, that in the end will make it or break it whether we have 1.5 or not. And that they even given the IPCC a number here, up to 50% of terrestrial ecosystems to remain intact. Just to remind us that the climate science has come to this point where an integrated framework is essentially a must. Now, so much is at stake here, and I just think it's important always to remind ourselves that the entire scientific, let's say, battle on whether or not we are leaving a stable state of the planet is now over. This is the Osman et al. Paper, which actually is an input also in the IPCC, showing how we leave the last ice age 20,000 years ago. And just look at the straight line. This is like the integration of all the ice core data we have. This is the 12,000 years of extraordinary stability on planet Earth. It's a 14 degrees Celsius planet, plus minus 0.5. Plus minus 0.5. And this is, as you know, the entire era of civilizational development as we know it. Before this time, we were hunters and gatherers living in caves. So we have now scientifically a reference point for the desired state of the planet, and we're showing that also nature, hydrology, nitrogen, phosphorus stayed within a very narrow range in this phase. So that's a reference point for why we have to take an integrated Earth system approach. You've probably seen this graph from the IPCC confirming in all these colored columns here this assumption that over the next 80 years, the only safe landing for 1.5 is assuming that nature will continue to absorb roughly 50% of our emission of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel burning on land and in ocean. So backwards, we know that nature has been giving us this tremendous service, and forward, we assume that it will continue. Now, we have been working, if you take next, with colleagues at CI and with scientists around the world, mapping the tipping element systems across the world that regulates the climate system. And if you take the next as well, we don't have to lock ourselves here. These are 16 systems. Those were the ones you had on the map here before. And what we find is with IPCC type red embers assessment of scientific confidence intervals, so darker the red, the higher the scientific certainty of crossing tipping points. On the y-axis here is global mean surface temperature. If you click on the next, you'll see the 1.5 degrees Celsius line, and that on average, these points here are the average points of the likely temperature when tipping points will be crossed. And you see we have 5 systems that we today, in this science paper published just in September this year, are likely to cross their tipping points. And we're talking about the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, holding 10 meters sea level rise together, likely to cross tipping points at 1.5. But you also see all the tropical coral reef systems with a very narrow uncertainty range, the Barents Sea ice, and abrupt thawing of permafrost. So it shows us that 1.5 is not a goal, it's not a target, it's a physical limit. It is something that we cannot negotiate with, and we need to stay within it, but the only way to do it is an integrated approach between the 2 different carbon laws. So together with CI colleagues, we proved this in a paper just a year back, showing that if we did not have nature, we would already have crashed through 1.5 degrees Celsius already today. So thanks to nature, the nature we've not destroyed yet, we can actually say that we are still having a window open, but barely. So it's of course no doubt in anyone's mind today that we need a carbon law for nature to have a chance of being able to have a safe landing. But again, it's not an offsetting strategy, it's an additionality. And Mike, over to you to give us the story on the numbers behind this carbon law for nature.
Thank you so much, Johan. And if you want to have a seat, you'll join me on the panel as soon as we have Q&A. So the Exponential Roadmap for Natural Climate Solutions, Johan just introduced the first piece of that, the carbon law for nature, and why it is so critical for our ecosystem integrity and to keep that limit, not target, but limit of 1.5 degrees. So this is the carbon law for nature, again, that Johan just presented. Next slide, please. And I'd like to break it down a little bit. Going from 12.5 gigatons to 0 in just 8 years, actually 7 years because we're near the end of 2022, seems nearly impossible. But actually nature is quite different than fossil fuels and fossil emissions. At the same time that nature is a source in some places, as we cut down our forests, as we drain wetlands and they emit carbon, nature is also a sink in other parts of the world. And we can both increase the sink and reduce the sources at the same time. So right now on the planet, we have about 23 gigatons of gross emissions from land use and land use change, while at the same time we have 10.5 gigatons of sinks elsewhere where nature is recovering. That adds up to that 12.5 gigatons of net source. If we drop from 23 gigatons of gross source to 17 gigatons of gross source, while at the same time increasing sinks, from 10.5 gigatons to 17 gigatons. That gets us to net zero by 2030. That's imminently doable. That is not even a 50% cut in gross emissions. That's not even a doubling of net sinks. This is imminently doable, and it's something that we must do. Next slide, please. So there are supposed to be words on this slide, as you might expect, and the titles have worked for some of us and not for others. So apologies for the error here. But what this is showing here, or intending to show, is that we have organized natural climate solutions differently in this paper. Traditionally, the science behind natural climate solutions has been done by ecologists, by geographers, many of us in the room, in fact, who think about ecosystems, who think about a forest, who think about a wetland, who think about a grassland, and try to understand the science of how much carbon that's emitting and how much carbon it could hold instead. And that has been a very powerful way to organize our science so far. But we're trying to organize solutions, not just science. We need to reorganize around people to deliver the acceleration of solutions in natural climate and nature that we need. So this graph is supposed to be showing you 5 different groups of people on the land: indigenous peoples and local communities, foresters, farmers, grazing land managers, and lastly, government land managers. These are the 5 groups of people on the land that we have organized our analysis around, and then 4 enabling actor groups. Social movements up at the top. We've got businesses, third from the bottom, so a supply of a box of something, so supply chain companies largely. We've got finance sector on the bottom, and we've got governments that work together with their people. So our 4 enabling actor groups: social movements, governments through policy, finance, and businesses, all need to be working together with the people on the land and connecting to the people on the land to deliver these green and pink and purple lines, which we're about to see what they mean. Next slide, please. So here we have words, thankfully. So green, purple, and red represent the 3 main categories of natural climate solutions, and these are our 8 action tracks. When we organize our science of natural climate solutions around people, we have a different set of solutions that emerge. And the solutions that emerge when we focus on people are, most of the big ones here in the middle are an individual actor group. So indigenous people and local communities, rights and resources to protect the lands that they have traditional rights to and access and management techniques for. We have climate smart forestry, which actually delivers both protection outcomes as well as management outcomes. If you incentivize smart and better and higher return forestry, the foresters will protect that land against incursion by agriculture and other uses. So you can actually get protection outcomes by managing forests better. We've got climate smart grazing, so grazing systems around the world where we could sequester more carbon into the soils. And we've got climate smart farming, where there are opportunities to both reduce emissions and significantly sequester new carbon into those soils. Moving out, we also have 2 demand side tracks: diet shift and food waste, which is a critical part of the solution, and we need to recognize that. As those of us working on natural climate solutions, we have to keep in mind that demand side signal. We also have no deforestation supply chains, which results in protection outcome. You'll notice that there are dotted lines in a few of these. This is still scientific work. So these dotted lines represent avoiding double counting. So when you actually go out and try to buy no deforestation products, the actual avoided deforestation that occurs somewhere on the earth is likely to be in a protected area that didn't get degraded, or an indigenous people's land that was no longer incurred into, or forestry lands that are no longer cut down and converted to agriculture. So we have to be very careful about not double counting. And lastly, on the right, you'll see forest and wetland restoration. It's surprising to some audiences how small the restoration circle is. These circles all represent mitigation opportunity in 2030, and there are 2 things that are making that circle seem small. The first is that restoration in our paper represents a land use perspective. So we're only counting restoration where there's a conversion from a degraded land or a working land into a more natural and significantly natural state. So conversion back to nature. That's what we're calling restoration. A lot of folks include restoration techniques on working lands. So a lot of the tons that we identify here in the managed categories are actually restoration techniques. Increasing soil, increasing the health of our working lands is a restoration, but that's appearing in pink here for our graph. So just something to note. So next slide, please. The second reason I meant to mention is that if you plant trees, they take decades to grow. So just because we have restoration in 2030 looking small, we can't wait to get started. The restoration has to get started, and it will return carbon sequestration over the coming years and decades. So I mentioned food systems, and I want to be careful not to conflate diet shift and food waste, which is one of our action tracks, one of the levers we can pull to change what's happening on the land, with the actual integration of land use and natural climate solutions with food systems. So we've estimated that close to 80% of natural climate solution opportunity in 2030 is tightly linked to our food systems. So not just this 2.5 gigatons from shifting diets, but almost all of our opportunity in 2030. And that's because protection right now has to come from avoiding conversion to agriculture. Most of the forest loss, most deforestation, most peatland clearing is driven by agriculture right now. And even the parts that aren't directly driven by agriculture are driven by the costs of land that are coming from the demand for land from agriculture. So a recent paper estimated 97% of ecosystem destruction is coming from the agriculture system, either directly or indirectly through financial signals. And then obviously the climate smart farming and grazing are part of our food systems. Next slide, please. So I talked about innovations that we have in this report. The first is the one Johan introduced, a new benchmark for nature, for a carbon law for nature, sitting aside the carbon law for fossil emissions. The second is to shift our focus to people and really try to organize our science around the people on the land and the enabling actors that need to deliver this acceleration. The third is to actually map out that acceleration. And so the curves that you see in front of you right here are the acceleration curves of mitigation across these tracks and across these protect, manage, and restore categories that we know from bottom-up analysis, from land use accountants, from folks like Stephanie Rowe at WWF, like Bronson Griscom at CI, like the teams at TNC that are here in the room and organizing this pavilion. They have done the science to count up how many tons of mitigation are available from every part of our Earth. And all of them are of course estimates. We'll discover new ones. Some of them won't pan out. But what we do know is that there is nearly 12.5 to 13 gigatons of cost-effective mitigation available by 2030, and up to 23, 21, 22, 23 gigatons by 2050 if we have a rising carbon price. So these curves map out how quickly we have to ramp up the acceleration of mitigation over time in the next 3 decades to deliver on the carbon law for nature. The carbon law for nature is a top-down view. It's from the integrated assessment models and assumptions about what fossil will do with the carbon law. This is the bottom-up view. This is what can be done cost-effectively, what we know we can do, and where we need to do it, and how fast we need to accelerate those outcomes. These curves, you'll notice, are shaped a little differently. And that's because there's a hierarchy of mitigation. So just like you reduce, reuse, then recycle, those 3 categories, we need to protect what we have, reducing the amount of land that we're using by protecting it from conversion. We need to manage, which is reuse, essentially. We need to use the land we're already using better. And then we need to restore. That's like recycling, taking the land that's being used poorly and getting it back into the system. And that is actually a hierarchy. We have to protect the most quickly. So this curve has us cutting ecosystem destruction in half every 5 years for the next decade to deliver 4 gigatons of mitigation in 2030 and 5 gigatons by 2050. The managed curve is surprising to many. We have more than 50% of the Earth's surface is working lands, and this curve reaches 8 gigatons of mitigation with only climate smart management of 20% of those working lands. So we can get to 8 gigatons of avoided emissions and carbon sequestrations on our managed lands with only 20% of the farmlands and grazing lands of the world. We need to double mitigation every year from climate smart management between now and 2026 to get there. That doubling is that exponential growth of solutions that we need to see, and that's daunting, but it is doable and cost effective. And lastly, we need to get started on restoration, as I mentioned, immediately so that it can deliver the tons we need. This only represents natural restoration, so this is not conversion of fields into plantations. This is only restoration of natural forests and wetlands over on the right. Next slide, please. So again, we should have words, but I think we can understand what regions of the world we're looking at here. This is, my point with this slide was really to emphasize that while I'm talking mostly about the global scale benchmarks that we need and acceleration rates we need, the NCS roadmap has rich spatial data under it. We've been looking at data both at the pixel scale, at the national scale, and at the regional scale, and I'm going to step away from where the speaker is. And if you actually start to break down spatially where these opportunities are, you can start going after them. So in this this map, we can see that a lot of the protection opportunity, this is not a surprise to most of us in this room, is in the major tropical forest basins of Earth. That's where most of the green is. I think it's a little surprising to folks how much opportunity there is for climate smart management of working lands across the tropics. There's also a huge amount of opportunity for managing land smarter in the global north. So if anyone tells you that natural climate solutions are all about the global south, you need to have a conversation with them about all of the work that needs to be happening up here as well. And that's an important point. Next slide, please. So this one is going to be the most challenging because this is my take-home messages. So you can read them here, but I actually do know what they are. So the first take-home message here is really just reiterating that carbon law for nature. To achieve 1.5 degrees, to keep it within reach, to climb through that window that is still open but closing, we need to reach net zero from all anthropogenic land and nature emissions by 2030. It's hard, but it's doable. We showed how it's doable with this roadmap. The second point is that the 1.5 degrees is a scientific limit, it's not a target, and that if we accelerate actions, as we know at cost-effective levels, we can deliver on that carbon law for nature. Thanks, Irene, there's no reason. We want to emphasize that there's 3 categories of actions we need to take: protection, management, and restoration, and that we need to put them on a hierarchy and get moving on them quickly. We also want to emphasize that those all have co-benefits and reasons to do them other than carbon. So while our measure here has been carbon, our coin of the realm in this analysis is carbon. When you invest in carbon in nature, you get so much more. And actually, we have goals that are much broader. And one of our next steps is actually to look at how much you get from a nature positive lens when you follow a roadmap for carbon. So how much biodiversity, ecosystem integrity, nature's contribution to people will you achieve by following the carbon law? And I'm excited to get into that research and analysis in the coming year. The next take-home point is that food systems are 80% of the solution in natural climate solutions. And the last point is that this has to be about people. So we need to focus on the people on the land and the enabling actors who are unlocking this opportunity if we're going to make change. And it's also a process that we're inviting people to join us on. So thank you very much. Back to you. One more thing. No, don't worry about it. No. We'll talk about next steps if there are questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I will invite Johan back to the stage, and we will have a panel discussion and also invite questions from the audience, please. So first of all, key takeaways. Johan, thank you so much for stressing that integrated framework is a must. And I'd also take that point of the Earth systems approach is essential, and nature within it, of course. Clearly, your findings are terribly sobering, and I'd love to hear from you where you are seeing evidence of progress and where we can draw hope in addressing these tipping points that you've identified. Also, it'd be great to hear specifically in that broader sense of hope around positive evidence around protection of intact nature, of nature in general?
Well, to begin with, I think one has to be, very clear and honest. We're seeing very little progress when you add up things at the global level, both on the emission pathway, as we always discuss and focus on, but also on the carbon sinks in nature. The global carbon project, the global carbon budget was presented yesterday, showing again another year of evidence that on terrestrial ecosystems we are gradually losing the carbon sink capacity, which is why the Exponential Roadmap on a carbon law for nature is so urgent. So on the one hand, there's good news in the sense that we have 40% of land area on planet Earth still in a reasonable intact shape. It's just that it's under stress and needs very rapid protection and widening even further so that it can be kept resilient. But I would argue that we have very little signs of positive trajectories at the global level. I mean, you have many projects on the ground that are giving proof that we can scale regenerative, carbon sequestering, biodiversity improving practices. And what is really exciting there is, as Mike points out, that the numbers here are enormously large when it comes to sustainable grazing and climate smart agriculture and sustainable forestry. There's no magic behind these numbers. I mean, these are proven practices. It's just that we're not operating them at scale. So if you call that good news, well, of course, the good news is that these are not theory numbers. These are not academic models. These are based on real empirical assessments of potentials on the ground. But the challenge still remains.
Absolutely, and I just want to take advantage of what you're saying to also elevate the awareness of the importance of a successful outcome in the CBD COP15 that follows COP27. We need a robust global biodiversity framework precisely to help address this sobering reality. So thank you for that, Johan. And now moving on to a key takeaway that I take from you, Michael, was it's so encouraging to see a people-centered approach to how we break down this potential that nature provides. And so I know that you've been presenting this work in New York Climate Week in multiple audiences. Here in COP27, you've also done multiple presentations. You've been speaking to multiple stakeholders. It'd be fantastic to hear how you're seeing the uptake and reactions from audiences on this.
Thank you for that question, Irene. So you focused on the people-centered approach, so I'll answer there first. And I think in our report so far, I would like to say that we have proven already with this roadmap that a people-centered approach will revolutionize natural climate solutions. But I can't say that. So right now, it is still a hypothesis that a people-focused view and a new science of natural climate solutions focused on people and social science married together with physical science is going to help us unlock the acceleration we need. So I hesitate to present hypotheses in a major report usually, but I think I'm pretty confident that this one will prove correct. And one of the responses I've gotten when I present this is an energy about that idea, about that concept that resonates deeply with the audiences. So that gives me hope that we're on a very clear path to impact. The second thing that I would say that is really resonating is the carbon law for nature, the simplicity of a net zero for all anthropogenic land emissions by 2030. You can explain that to your grandmother. You could explain that in an elevator to somebody who doesn't know much about climate, and environmental and social expert in a company, the lead for ESG in a company, can go to their CEO and explain that. And they can convince them that the science is clear on that because we've done the science, and they can make sure that that company is onboarding that message. So a simple message is often very difficult for scientists to come up with, but can be a very, very powerful tool for change.
Absolutely, that's incredibly encouraging, agree. So I want to open up the floor now for questions, and we will be discussing precisely that last point that you indicated, Mike, of the uptake and implementation in the second part of this session. So now I see 4 hands, 5, and we have a mic that will head your way very quickly. Over on the, yes, and then we have 1, 2 in the back. Thank you. And then we'll come in the front. So please.
Hello. Too noisy. Thank you so much. That was so interesting to listen to. I'm thinking as you're talking about the big food companies and big business in general, and what is needed to get them aligned with what you presented, and what is preventing, the big things that are preventing from them being aligned to this.
Excellent. I want to take a couple more. Please.
Hey.
Sorry, can I take your question for the second section?
Oh, sure.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
of
So I'll pass on to
Sure.
a colleague. Thank you.
Thank you. I think in your experience, I work for an organization that does a lot of conservation and restoration work on the ground. And based on the science, what would you say needs to shift in regards to how conservation organizations are maybe developing their work in line with the most effective tools for carbon capture through natural carbon solutions, just because it's obviously quite an established industry that has its own ways of doing things. It'd be really interesting to hear what you think needs to shift. And also, just in addition to that, as the climate is shifting and the natural processes are shifting in line with that, how do we take that into account when we're thinking about the restoration and protection of spaces? Thank you.
Thank you. And Francis, can you please pass the microphone here in the front? And thank you, Nadim, for your indulgence. I'll take your question in the second session, please. And I'll open up in just a moment.
Yes, and mine might be more for the implementation, but I'm wondering, you were talking about how there are already good examples of practices that we're seeing on the ground that just need to be scaled up. So I'm curious about how much the roadmap will draw on and lift up some of these case studies.
Okay. Thank you. I'll pause here for these 3 questions, and then I'll take 3 more questions from the audience. So over to you.
Yes, I think the first question about how can a carbon law for nature become meaningful for the big food industry is of course will be the fundamental litmus test of this framework. And I think that to begin with, we're seeing a trend line, not fast enough, but still I think most food industries recognize that they have to go beyond just carbon in the Science-Based Target Initiative fashion or just in the Paris Agreement standard fashion, that they need to move faster towards also having nature, climate solutions as part of their accounting scheme, and that we can offer that as a standardized methodology, allowing companies to define their pathways to a net zero point, but under that pathway distinguish what is the part of nature, what is the part of the fossil fuel phase out. And that is rapidly needed because today it's misused. It's misused in a way that not so much in food companies, but in energy companies use it as an offsetting mechanism. So you invest in nature because you're unable to get off fossil fuels. We need to tidy that up. And I think the food industry can be a good example of companies that can early among sectors see the benefits, because they depend so much on what's happening on the ground. I mean, otherwise you cannot source your grain or your fruit or your vegetables. So I think we have something to offer them. But you're right that I guess that's what you were concerned about, that how do you get them to get serious? And of course, to get serious, you need to have an accounting scheme, and you have to go beyond just the voluntary mechanisms. It has to go into the regulatory frame, and the question is how we do that. And I think COP15 and with the climate COP and the biodiversity COP needs to collaborate to get into policy decisions that are regulatory, compulsory on both nature and climate. So you have a legally binding climate agreement, but you need to have a legally binding agreement on keeping the restoration and the management and the building carbon in nature as part of that compulsory scheme. And we're far away from that, true, but I think that has to be put on the table.
Wonderful. And I'll take the second question. And before I do that, I'd like to check if Milagros Sandoval is with us by any chance. Oh, so good to see you. Okay, glad you're here. Thank you. I didn't see you back there. So the second question was about implementation on the ground and how what we're seeing as limitations and opportunities really for unlocking and making sure that that's working well. I have to admit I'm an expert in global analysis and thinking in these big models and how we put it all together to add up to solutions change at the systems scale. And while CI does a huge amount of work, I don't, so I'm probably not the best person to answer this. We do have a number of case studies in the report in each section about where in the world in our portfolio in CI, but also WWF and the Nature Conservancy, these are actually working on the ground. But what I will say from where I sit is that there has not been enough focus on the economic returns and the livelihoods and the ways that people live and interact with land. Land is not carbon, and trees are not carbon to people who live around them. They are only carbon to those of us sitting here in Sharm el-Sheikh today. So if we approach communities simply through a carbon lens, I think we're going to fail. And that's why it's also so important to bring together the kinds of conversations that we're going to be having in Montreal in a few weeks, because nature is more. And so even though, as I said, this is a map for carbon, one of our big next steps is really to try to bring in the nature positive agenda. And it's critical for the work on the ground that nature positive agenda isn't just carbon, isn't just biodiversity, but actually is about livelihoods. It's about how people both live on the land and make a living on the land. And other research that we've done shows that it's also about how people stay healthy on the land. Where is that coming from? Oh no. If you can turn off the microphone in the audience if it's still on, that would be awesome. Thank you. So the recent research we've done is showing that trees and ecosystem services include health outcomes for people living and working on the land. If you lose the trees, the temperature can go up 5-10 degrees centigrade in an area. So we need to be taking into account all of those suites of services that people on the land experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we have 3 more hands up, but I do want to invite the panelists of the second session to the stage, and I will get to those questions once we have covered. Please remain on the panel if you can. And I will invite, first of all, Shaila Raghav, who is the head of portfolios and partnerships of Time CO2. And Time CO2 has just launched CO2.com, which is a platform for businesses to maximize impact for climate, nature, and people through portfolios of investment. I also want to invite Milagros Sandoval. Milagros Sandoval is the Director General of Climate Change and Desertification of the Ministry of Environment of Peru. And she's also the co-facilitator of the UNFCCC Coronivia joint work program that is being negotiated here in the UNFCCC. So welcome to you both. So first, I'd like to think of this session as one that captures the importance of collaboration. And I really like that we had that slide up because it talked about the next steps. But I just want to highlight very quickly that Exponential Roadmaps for Natural Climate Solutions has been collaborating with multiple other scientific processes. And I said at the beginning, it has been already reflected and coordinated in harmony with the State of Climate Action, the State of Climate Action, and also the System Change Lab report. And likewise, it has already been uptaken by the COP27 presidency's ENACT Nature-Based Solutions Partnership that will be launched. So that's very exciting to see this uptake already. And I would love to provide more details of that, but I really want to pick up space and go into the implementation and really look at how do we achieve the acceleration of natural climate solutions through the comments and experiences of both Shaila and Milagros. So Milagros, it'd be wonderful to hear from you particularly. If you could share opportunities of the barriers and the opportunities that you've seen in Peru on the implementation of natural climate solutions, how natural climate solutions has been captured already in the NDCs, and also if you could please indulge us on how you see this coming forth in the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. Because next year there will be a huge opportunity to capture progress of the implementation of the whole Paris Agreement, but understanding progress on nature would also be very helpful. So, Milagros, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. And it's great to be part of this panel with colleagues that are very dear to me. First of all, I do think that it is important to highlight that Peru is definitely a country that most of its NDC is related to nature-based solutions. Why? Because our major emissions come from the LULUCF sector. So that definitely we have to develop the measures related to the NDC. We have to look at the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And I think that's very important to highlight, that that's one of our main instruments in order to define our NDC. And in Peru, obviously, this is related to mitigation, but I first would like to highlight the adaptation. Peru is very vulnerable. It is very, very vulnerable, and it's important to highlight that our NDC and the main objective of all of these issues are related to adaptation. If our country does not adapt, then we cannot speak about mitigation. So definitely our main focus is related to adaptation. And in adaptation, we're also talking about nature-based solutions. We have specific measures on adaptation related to water resources, to agriculture, to forestry, that are related and are linked, obviously, to those that are reflected in the mitigation sector. So first, let me just mention, first of all, the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory as the basis of decision making. So the importance of having better greenhouse gas inventories every time. It's a work in progress. It's important to have that information. Actually, we are working on our greenhouse gas inventory for 2019. So that's important because we are keeping up on moving forward and having much better information to take decisions. Second of all, the NDC, both the adaptation and the mitigation. In adaptation, 84 measures related to become a more resilient country, and for mitigation, 63 measures. We had 62 until 2 months ago. We have 63 now because we have included another measure related to nature-based solutions, which I can develop a little bit further on. But it's important also to highlight that if you see and if you read Peru's NDC, and especially not specifically the NDC, but the measures that are approved under our climate change governance, most of these measures are related to climate change, to nature-based solutions, because definitely that's important to identify and clarify that countries like Peru, like others in the region, are definitely have this importance of linking this, and also especially linking it to sustainable development. We're not only talking about reaching our goals related to the mitigation or adaptation or related to NDC, but we are speaking about important co-benefits. What co-benefits? And maybe this I want to link it to the issues related to biodiversity. Countries like Peru are very biodiverse. And if we don't address that also in our NDC, and especially in the implementation of the measures, we are not going to reach the goals. And we're not only speaking about carbon, we're speaking about other co-benefits that are important to consider in this discussion. Definitely also, and based on what I saw in the presentation I think that those are very linked, and actually my team was around, so I made them see the slide related to all these possible solutions, right? And most of them are reflected in our NDC, including indigenous peoples. And how do we include indigenous peoples in this process? How can we support their livelihoods throughout the NDC, throughout the measures we're working? And actually, one of our latest measures related to mitigation is based on the important role not only of national protected areas, but also of subnational protected areas, which can also support the governance of subnational governments, and that can link corridors, important corridors to support, again, biodiversity, livelihoods, and obviously related to mitigation and reducing emissions related to deforestation. And also something I would like also to highlight here is that we are not only speaking necessarily of the NDC solely, but also of our long-term strategies. And for long-term strategies, Peru is working actually right now updating its long-term strategy for 2050. We are proposing to be carbon neutral by 2050, and the support and the work we have been doing, we have a carbon neutrality study which has assessed the different possibilities of how to be carbon neutral, and definitely the LULUCF sector is a main part of this. And one thing that definitely is part of this discussion is how does a country like Peru, that is still developing, that still needs to consider and address different needs and priorities of its population, can benefit from carbon neutrality. And the study that we made together with the University of Costa Rica, the Pacific University in Peru, and with support also of IDB, as well as other cooperation, has established that definitely there is a possibility of reaching carbon neutrality and having benefits. And specific benefits are relating to having a net benefit of $140 billion by 2050, thanks to carbon neutrality. So definitely that's something important to address, and it's part of the assessment that we have to make in order to address issues related to nature in our NDC, because we need to identify those benefits for the livelihoods of the people that are more closer to nature as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Milagros. Such powerful words, precisely on the systems approach and how NDCs are being used as a motor for development, for sustainable development, and bring all of these co-benefits, and that you've quantified is very, very powerful. Also encouraging to hear how decision makers have been using the Exponential Roadmap. So congratulations for your work there. I want to move on to Shaila Ragav and ask you, Shaila, from an investor's perspective, how do you believe the Exponential Roadmap for Natural Climate Solutions could inspire the allocation of financial resources for financial institutions? And after your response, I will go back to the questions on the floor.
Yeah. Thank you, Irene, and really, really honored and delighted to be here and to see so many friends and colleagues from over the years. I think we've come such a long way. I think many of us were involved in the early days when we coined this term, nature is 30% of the solution to climate change, and really having that high-level articulation and high-level target was really powerful, but in order to make it actionable and in order to make it investable, I think this tool really is an incredibly powerful articulation of the specific investable pathways to be able to reach that global potential. I think it's everyone here must be aware that only 2% of global climate finance, or maybe 3% under some assessments, is going towards natural climate solutions. And if you look at that specific type of finance, only 14% of it is actually coming from the private sector, which is really quite a mismatch and a disparity when you look at all climate finance, where about 56% of it is derived from the private sector. So you really see that natural climate solutions are quite dependent on, for the most part, grant-based finance with very little commercial or private sector incentive as it currently stands. I would say that there's a couple different levers. In particular, there's way more finance going into destroying nature than there is into protecting it. So I think a really important priority for all of us here is to find ways to redirect finance from activities that are destroying and incentivizing unsustainable agricultural expansion, for example, or supporting perverse subsidies that are really kind of going against the potential of natural climate solutions. The other thing is we're also seeing a lot of innovative finance instruments that are emerging, whether it's debt for nature swaps, which of course have been around for many decades, but are starting to be deployed and utilized more recently as an important lever in places like Barbados or Seychelles. We've also seen bonds that have been created that have been that are issued on the basis of measured improvements in biodiversity or wildlife. And of course, there's kind of this whole space of carbon finance and REDD+ mechanisms and jurisdictional approaches that are really looking at trying to, from a top-down, introduce the incentives and the forcing mechanism to be able to make nature more valuable standing than cut down.
Absolutely. Very, very encouraging to hear this, and absolutely agree with the shift to trillions. And if we get to the trillions, it's because we will also bring in the private finance. And I just add regarding the subsidies that it's not only looking at how we clean financial flows of public funds through the subsidies, but also how investments of private financial institutions are not destroying nature as well. And that's something that in the Climate Champions we've been doing, of integrating nature into the net zero targets, ensuring that private financial institutions are tackling deforestation, of commodity-driven deforestation by 2025. So thank you so much for that, Shaila. Thank you, Milagros. I want to open up the floor in the last few minutes that we have and pass on to a colleague in the back, and then to the 10,000 landscapes, Nadim, as well.
Hello? Yes. So my question here is that this roadmap for natural climate solutions is focusing a lot on increasing the sinks and reducing the sources. And one of the major sinks which are slowly degrading is the ocean sink, where the ocean might turn into a source later on. So my question is, are there natural climate solutions for maintaining the oceans as a sink and not having them become a source or in the future so that's the main question that I have. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And if we could pass the microphone now to Nadim Damien of 1000 Landscapes. Thank you so much again for your patience.
Thank you. My question is directed to Michael in specific, knowing that Conservation International is a core partner of the 1000 Landscapes for a Billion People initiative, which is working to empower landscape partnerships around the world. And I'm wondering what role do these landscape partnerships play in implementing the Exponential Roadmap, and how is the 1000 Landscapes initiative more broadly helping that happen?
Thank you. Please, over to Johan and then Mike.
Yeah, let me focus on the ocean question, because it's a really important one, and I'll have to problematize that slightly. Remember that what the ocean is providing us in terms of both heat uptake and carbon dioxide uptake is only a reflection of stress. It's nothing positive. It's only negative. It's causing a chemical crisis, the ocean acidification. pH levels have gone down by 30%. So carbon dioxide uptake in the ocean is a tremendous subsidy and protection of humanity on Earth, but it's nothing that we defend. It's nothing that we can rely on. It's simply a negative. On land, it's actually the same. The reason why nature is taking up so much carbon dioxide is a reflection of stress. A planet in equilibrium has exactly the same amount of carbon taken up as it releases. So it's a stress factor. So what we need to recognize is that on land we need to manage nature in a healthy way so that it can still continue helping us, because that stress factor we can live with because it's intensified photosynthesis. It's more biomass. That's kind of a good thing. We can actually manage that. But in the ocean, we have to be so much more careful, and we need to protect as much possible of the nature in marine ecosystems, but I would say not rely on building up more carbon dioxide uptake capacity. It should be said, though, to close this, that if we have healthy mangrove systems, healthy fish populations, healthy coral reef systems, they are much better at having phytoplankton, animal plankton, and kind of healthy levels of biomass. So when you kill off and cross a tipping point in marine systems, they also lose carbon. So it's a really delicate balance to recognize that we cannot just consider the ocean being this huge waste bin to continue taking up carbon dioxide and heat.
Thank you. Mike?
Thank you, Johan, and thank you for the question, Nadeem. So you mentioned landscape partnerships and the 1,000 Partnerships Initiative, and I think it brings up one of our next steps here, which is really the idea of downscaling the roadmap for natural climate solutions in specific places. And one of our next steps is really to work with countries to inform their NDCs and NBSAPs. As we heard from Milagros, many of these activities are already in these plans and long-term plans as well. And we would like to bring the roadmap to those countries and offer it as a potential tool for using it as a measure against the carbon law for nature, and also to identify the people-centered solutions that they're already doing and how they add up to systems change around the world. So part of that downscaling is certainly jurisdictional approaches and landscape approaches and bringing it to that level as well. So the 1,000 Landscapes Partnership is this kind of radical collaboration across diverse organizations that we'd also like to see with the roadmap. So one of our slides earlier on our next steps had those next steps arrayed around the word coalition, because this really is not just about people on the ground and the enabling actor groups. It's about the people who are trying to bring change to the planet as well. That's all of us. And we can't do that alone. We each have our piece of the puzzle. As I heard this morning in our session, you can think of this carbon problem as 60 billion pieces of the puzzle, with each piece as 1 ton of carbon. And none of us can do a puzzle with 60 billion pieces. We need all of us. And so that's where I really would love to see more collaboration at that landscape scale as well. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We're at time, but I do want to thank our panelists. This has been such an exciting session. It's clear, and I'm a testament to how the Exponential Roadmap has been a partner in radical collaboration with multiple fronts. It is, as you have seen in this session, a comprehensive strategy grounded in science, and we've already seen how it can be downscaled. Thank you so much, Milagros, for giving us that evidence and proof points. And also, lastly, we need to upscale. So we need to downscale on the implementation, but we need to upscale to the trillions of dollars and truly influence financial flows, align that to the Paris Agreement, and natural climate solutions is at the heart of that. So thank you so much. Please, a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you so much.